Hey there, Mari.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Good. How was school today?
School was long today. Today's the day I teach from home. So I taught straight from 7 to 3:30. So if they say teachers don't earn their money, I don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's been, yeah, like we've talked many times about the craziness of this year and how it's a whole new level of exhaustion. I thought I knew teacher tired, but this is a whole new level. So I'm really excited. We talk all the time, but we don't usually talk about your chapter and about Flip the System. So I'm excited to dive into this and to not only hear in depth some of the narratives that you had to shorten for the chapter because you were up against a word limit, but also to expand upon some of the themes and to share those with others who are listening. So for those of you that are joining us, I'm speaking with Mairi Cooper, who is not only a former Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year, she is also the president of the Pennsylvania Teachers Advisory Committee, and a chapter author in Flip the System US, How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy. So Mari, start by telling me, you start with a narrative about the county jail and your students. So why don't you start by sharing that story?
So my students had wanted for a few years to go and play at the county jail, but they had never sort of been able to make it happen. And I wasn't able to make it happen. And really what it required was a huge amount of persistence. So I have one student who was pretty fervently interested in going and passionate about social justice. And he just tracked it down like a bulldog. I mean, he just kept at it and at it and at it until I think they didn't have anything to do but to respond to us. And so we went, and I had no idea what to expect at all. And it was incomparable for my students, mainly because for my students, I teach in a suburban, predominantly white school district that has a really large socioeconomic diversity. So one of the 1,000 wealthiest neighborhoods in the United States, but two of the poorest boroughs in Allegheny County are in my district. So it's a real mix of kids and that we get, and of experiences and opportunities that they've had. And I wasn't sure when we went to the jail what to expect, because I also have an enormous political spectrum for my kids. And the kids that signed up to go were all over the map politically, and experientially, and in terms of their own diversity. I mean, it was just fascinating. So we went, and you are met at the jail, and it's hard because, right, we've got basses and cellos. I'm an orchestra director, so I'm lugging equipment like none other. We're on our little school bus. We get there, we walk across the cracked concrete thing. People are waving out of the walls of the windows. And my students go in, and they are met with, how do we get a double bass through the metal detector? And there's an end pin, and it's sharp, and it's not probably safe to have it someplace. And eventually they just gave up and let us in. But I think that what was incredible was not so much the playing was great, but it was the when the inmates decided they could ask questions. So they had been turning around to the guards, and I didn't know why, because we had been told that they would be told they could ask us anything. And I had been begging, like, please talk to us. And when they finally said, are we allowed to? And a guard said yes. The conversation that ensued was earth-shattering. I mean, it just was amazing. An enormous number of people who are at our county jail are just there simply because they couldn't pay to have for bail. So they haven't been tried. Our system is so backed up that many of them have been there for a couple of years. They have children the same age as our kids who were playing. They talked to them as if they were sons and daughters. They sat down and said, please be careful about your choices. And they also didn't want to be seen, as if they were guilty, because quite frankly, they may not have been. And I think for my students, the thing that happened then was that statistics became human. And I I think that it's really critically important that what we offer children is to understand other people's experiences. And I don't think that they can do that in a bubble. I think they have to step into a different world and be confronted by it and be able to converse within it and ask their own questions. And there's no better way to do that than through the arts. I mean, that's a really natural connection. There, music is a great bridge between two populations. And it was just really magical. But the magic actually, I walked out feeling that magic, but the magic for my students really came days later as they processed it and as
Yeah.
they really understood it.
So you and I have known each other for a while, and I think even before we met, what, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it's been now, even before we met,
Decades, Soskull, decades.
yeah, it's, right, it feels like it, right, in a good way. But you know, I think I always, if you would have asked me before you and I met, like, you know, do you support the arts? Do you believe that the kids should have an arts, you know, arts as part of their education? Like, I would have been unequivocally yes, and I would have made a case for it. But I don't think until I met you, I quite understood the nuances of how important it was and how it looked when it's right in school. And I think that story that you just told exemplifies that in such a great way. And the reason why I say it, why I say that in this interview, is because originally the chapter that I had talked to you about writing in the book was not this chapter. It was not a chapter on how to flip your classroom system. It was a chapter on the importance of the arts in democracy. And in a lot of ways, you still make that same case through your chapter, but you do it in a much more personal way, talking about your own students. So before we dive into your 4-step process and that you provide for teachers, I want you to talk a little bit about that, about how the arts are critical to functioning democracy, a healthy democracy, and what's the role of the arts in school in helping to promote that.
Well, I mean, I don't know that it has to be the arts. I mean, I honestly, I mean, my parents are both historians. So so my first language is really history. And the way that I look at things is really through a historical lens and quite frankly, frequently a Marxist lens, looking at it through class and how class impacts society. You know, I think that you could, that when we talk about democracy, we all, and particularly now, I think we all must be committed to discussing how that looks in each of our areas. So I don't think that it is specific to the arts. I think it is something that needs to be happening all over the place. What I think that the arts allows for is neutral ground. So I think that at a time when our country, all the adults in the world are struggling to have conversations in a civil manner and to hear each other empathetically on all sides of the aisle. I think that the arts allow for those conversations to happen. They allow for common ground and they allow for creativity, because the arts have to be nuanced. To be able to do art, there must be nuance. And I think that nuance is critically important. I think we've forgotten about that. I would say, like, so for instance, this week, I talked to my students about the importance of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? This is the big thing. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was an enormous lover of opera and of the arts. And a dear friend of mine, Eric Owens, she just adored him. And so he would tell stories about her at the Met. And being with her at the Met. But I said to my students, you know, what I wanted them to realize is that the thing that made her, in my mind, love the arts is the same thing that made her love Anthony Scalia. And that they could talk opera, they could talk history, they could then talk about positions that were diametrically opposed on a court. And have civil conversations and have true, really deep discussions that we need to be having in order to do that. But for my students, that was a way in, right? So for my students, they were able to say, wait a minute, you're telling us that we need to go read about, and I said, they were George and Martha Washington for Halloween. I was like, go read about Scalia and Ginsburg and understand that every time you walk into a section of the orchestra, that is what you do. You have to communicate with that nuance. You have to compromise. You can't, or else you'll be out of tune. You won't sound together. You won't. And it's the same thing if you're doing any kind of ensemble work, whether that's theater or music, or whether you're working to create sets together as artists. I mean, you always must do that as an ensemble.
Yeah, it's so yesterday I interviewed Estella Wima
Oh,
Church
and she
from
was
Los Angeles.
amazing. I saw that.
Right.
You know, I have an Estella thing. Like,
Right.
I just think she's remarkable.
And so I think she wouldn't put it in exactly the same words, but the sentiment is the same, what she does in her drama classes. But the other thing that strikes me about your answer there is the parallel that I see, and I think others that are watching can probably see, between that RBG Scalia connection that you talked about and how they saw each other as humans first, so that they could have those conversations, that shared humanity that they felt, and the parallel between your students in the jail, right? And finding that shared humanity with those who were incarcerated in that time, where in your words, you said that, those statistics then became human, right? It's the same way, and the arts were that bridge between those two things.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about the arts is that, when you get a proof, which I love geometry. So when you get a geometric proof and it works, right? It's a thing of beauty, but it's proved. And but there is no such thing as a perfect musical performance. It doesn't exist. It never has existed. It's always messy. Art is messy. Theater is messy. Music is certainly messy. And I think that breaking down these silos that we have and sort of relishing the mess, which is exactly right. That is what happened, because what happened at the jail was we walked in through barriers, and we had to figure out, like, we didn't make sense within those barriers. Like a group of high school kids carrying European instruments made no sense in the barriers of the county jail. But what did make sense was talking to people about the importance of music and how you create music and the power of beauty. Like, when did we stop talking about beauty? Where in school are we talking about beauty? What is beautiful? What do you really want for children? I want my children to be, if they have money, so be it. But if they have money and they don't have joy, what is that? Like, and I want them to understand that things are going to be difficult and they will get better. It's messy. Life is messy. Art is messy.
Yeah. So speaking about messiness and times where we struggle to find the nuance and to find joy, you write about that in your chapter, how you were going through a time where you were not at your best in the classroom, and how that led to the moments that really transformed what you do in your orchestra. And how you and the classroom philosophy in your classroom. So give a little bit about the background, and then I want to dive into the four ideas that you give to teachers and how to do this.
Okay, and you're gonna have to walk me through the 4 ideas beautifully.
I have them written down. I had to go back and reread the chapter also, because it's been a while, but I've got them written down so I can take you through them. No problem.
Excellent. I like that. I can count on you. So I always say, and I think this is appropriate now, that when I was teacher of the year, I was out of the classroom basically in and out for 2 years, which was probably in some ways more disruptive than having been there. And when you have an arts program, my students are used to having me 24/7 for 4 years, and I'm kind of their home. I'm where they end up residing in the building. So I was in and out, and my students had always done everything I had asked them to do, and they were very compliant, and I thought they were very vested in my program, and very vested in music. And that was how I understood it until they staged the revolution. And they staged a revolution. So my schedule is crazy from an arts perspective. I never have my orchestra together except for one rehearsal before a concert. So that's like saying, let's go play football without ever having the team together. And I don't even have like the O-line together in one class. I have like part of the O-line, part of defense. Like I never see a quarterback. So I have this one rehearsal, and it was a big concert because it was honoring the singers. And I had a couple of sophomores who had an AP test the next day, and they wanted to just skip the rehearsal. And so one thing led to another, and it wasn't pretty. They were allowed out because our assistant principal let them out. There were all sorts of layers of issues for me. But the real issue was that it became clear to me that my students had been doing what I thought they were vested in because they liked me. And I didn't understand that. They weren't doing it because they had some sort of drive and mission based on music, but they did it because they really cared about me, which is flattering, but not good teaching. Not a strong teacher moment. I've got millions of not strong teacher moments, but this was a really good one. So they staged the revolution, and I waited, because one thing I do know from teaching is like, give yourself, if you're heated under the collar, give yourself time to process and figure out before you address it. So 3 weeks later, I walked in the classroom and I said, why are you here? Like, this is an elective, you're in high school. Why are you here? And they looked at me like, well, and I said, no. I mean, really, like, what is it you want? And so they covered a wall in Post-it notes for why they thought we should give concerts. And it came down to 4 things. They wanted to give concerts for access for those who don't have access to live music. They wanted to give concerts for educational purposes. The Pittsburgh Symphony was on strike that year, so they also wanted to develop a wider audience for classical music, not just for people who came to our concerts, but for Pittsburgh. And then they wanted the sheer joy of playing. So I did that frightening thing. And honestly, it was because I had for 2 years been listening to amazing things that people were doing in their classrooms, including you, and water filtration systems. And I had not seen how that translated to music, and the way that it translated, especially like an orchestra. An orchestra is a white European aristocratic setup. That's what it is. Like, we need to call it what it is. That is what it is. And so how do you turn that over and make it relevant to a bunch of students who that's not their experience, nor do they necessarily want it to be their experience? And so I said to them, you can create whatever concerts you want if it meets one of these 4 things. And where are we heading with it? So every year we revisit it.
So you went over, you already covered the first recommendation that you had, which is determine the how, or I'm sorry, determine the why, right? You got the why down. So that's the first one. So before we jump into the how, which is what's next, what advice would you give to teachers that are not necessarily orchestra directors? So you're high school literature teacher, you're a middle school science teacher. How would this look? Because I'm putting myself in someone else's shoes. This has got to be terrifying. It had to be terrifying for you, right? Turning this over and asking students, like, to as a teacher, you've got to be incredibly vulnerable, because what if they say, like, the only reason we're doing this is to, get a grade in our grade book? Like, what does that tell you as a teacher?
It tells you something really important, right? Because I did have kids who were there for that. I did have kids who were like, I'm here because I had kids say, I'm here because my parents make me be here. And I said, well, is there anything that would make you want to be here? Do you see an importance in this? I think you can ask broader questions. And then I think you have to ask very broad questions. So what do you see the role of this being in the world in general? What is the role of science right now? Where do you see science in your daily life? What parts of that do you connect with? Like, are there, my husband is an incredible weather buff. I mean, I think that if it had to do with the weather, he would learn how to do really complicated, mathematical equations. Um, but I think then you find what is it that has meaning. And you have to be comfortable knowing that we can't, as teachers, we try to satisfy everybody. And we can't. Like,
Yeah.
maybe, I'm not the teacher for everybody. And so that means that there should be other teachers out there who are.
Yeah.
Schools should be made up of all sorts of different kinds of teachers, and we should all be applauding each other, and saying, let this be different. And when you go through this school, have a different experience. I think the other thing that I would say to teachers is be comfortable in silence, and be comfortable in their not knowing, and come back to it again. And think about different ways in, give yourself another day and come back to it the next day.
I think all of that is great advice, and I think that it's somewhere in the book. Although I've edited it so many times and written other things in the meantime, but I think that somewhere in there's a discussion about different kinds of relevance, and how so often we think about relevance in terms of, well, are kids going to need this after they graduate, right? And that's one kind of relevance, but it really doesn't matter to kids in the moment, right? That's not going to help them learn. What you're talking about is that other relevance, right? When you're asking those broader questions, how does this relate to you right now? How can you apply this to your life to make your life better, to make the lives of others better, so that you get what you need out of this educational experience? That's the kind of relevance that we should be discussing more in schools, I think.
And it's complicated, right? So I think that in a lot of ways, we now have, we've kind of gone to this thing where we say, what are your interests? And a lot of times I think we need to understand that kids don't know what their interests are. Their interests are whatever their parents have handed to them.
Yeah.
This is my interest because my parent wanted me to do whatever, play baseball, play the violin, whatever it is. So I think that's one thing, is to really start them down that path themselves, to try to find what is meaningful for them. I think that's critically important in a time where kids are more and more disconnected.
Yeah, and this is really this discussion right here is the crux of how to make classroom student-centered, right? Because the pushback from people who don't understand is often, well, kids are just running the show doing whatever they want. But not if you have a skilled teacher who understands that helping kids discover themselves is just as important as listening to what they're telling you about what their interest is right now, right?
Right. And some of it is that some of them aren't going to know, and you have to let them not know. So right. You also, like, a lot of my kids say it all the time. They're like, Miss Cooper, the people who really create the meaningful experiences that we do are juniors and seniors, because they've been as freshmen in the meaning in these things, and they start to think outside of, well, I'm comfortable with little kids, so let's do the little kid concert. And they sit down and say, hey, I kind of don't understand this world. Let's go step into that world. So I think some of it is also offering them opportunities offering them opportunities to see what that looks like, and then having discussions with them about how those kids got there. Right. How did those kids get to that point where they found meaning in that? Why was that meaningful for those kids? And making sure after we do something that we spend a lot of time unpacking it, and really getting through that.
Yeah. So talk to me about how this looks then. So your students have discovered these 4 pillars that they want to meet. So then what? How did your classes change?
It's messy. And I think this would look different for everybody depending upon who you are. So I am a big ideas person. I am, and details elude me from time to time. I'm a systems person. So for me, thinking about systems was really easy. And what it looked like me sitting down and saying, okay, how many concerts can we actually do? Like, let's be realistic. And I had to choose repertoire. So there were some nuts and bolts there, and I didn't want the tail to wag the dog. I have a curriculum I have to teach. So I think a lot of times when people hear, well, the orchestra director did it, they're like, well, the orchestra director did it because they don't actually have a set curriculum, which is absolutely not true. Like, I have skills and a sequential thing that I need to get my kids through as well. So I think that what it looks like is figuring out what your limitations are and how it fits in. And then how comfortable you are with allowing kids to do a lot of stuff. Because it did take a lot, the how took a lot of, it was messy. And you have to be prepared for mess, and you have to be prepared for failures. And you have to be careful about that. So I wrote this in the book about like having relationships with community. You know, my kids are going out into the community all the time. Well, if they had pushed through this whole thing with the county jail, but then I had nobody who would actually play there, that would be a failure. And I would have to allow that failure to exist. And we would never be able to go back to the county jail again. So some of it is making sure that they understand all that they're doing. Some of it is that there are times where they have failed and they have not pulled things off. And when they don't pull things off, they have to understand the consequences. Like, you know, they're right now struggling because of coronavirus. And so how does it look under coronavirus? We've started all afresh, right? We're all first year teachers this year, except that my kids also want to do virtual pop-ups. So they want to do these concerts, and they're struggling.
Yeah. So we're gonna get to and I know I'm keeping track. You haven't really explained what those pop-up concerts are yet, but we're gonna get to that. I'm gonna make sure that you share that, because you and I have talked and I know exactly what you're talking about, but I want to make sure that you explain that. But before we dive into that, I lost my train of thought for a second. I was going to go somewhere else.
How?
Yeah, no. So you were talking before about your kids had sticky notes, right? So they put all these sticky notes up on the wall, and then you kind of funneled that down into the pop-up concert. So yeah, so walk me through that process.
Okay, so so you want the how from the very beginning. We sat down, we said the why, and then the why became 4 reasons, and then we funneled those into those 4 reasons. And then after that, we sat down and said, okay, what concerts does that fit into, and what repertoire would that fit into? And they split into groups. In terms of doing that, I also did a lot of leadership training. So I did a lot that was incorporated in there with them learning how they think, how to get different people in groups, how to communicate with different people in groups. So there's a whole other layer of teaching that goes with this, that you can do in like really easy 5-minute segments that breaks up your class. So you just are doing, it's like your icebreaker, right? And so except that you're building leadership and you're letting them think about that. And so they sat down and they came up with who they were targeting. So for instance, and the same thing's happening with the virtual pop-ups now. So they're targeting, so their why, our 4 pillars haven't changed, but they've focused it on now access for the elderly, because the elderly are stuck in nursing homes. So they sit down, they say, there's our audience. What kinds of things would they like to hear? So they have to really step into a completely different universe of what is that? And then they have to figure out who do they have who can make it happen? I mean, it's just like any business, right? So who do they have who can make it happen, and how does that work? So I would say in a classroom, if I were like a history teacher and I wanted them to do, I'm just making this up off the top of my head, so it's gonna be a terrible analogy, but you wanted to get them really involved now in the electoral process. And the kids said, well, we're worried about voting. We're worried about whether people's ballots will be counted. And they said, well, in Pennsylvania yesterday, they said that we all have to have a special sleeve, that if we don't have this thing that our vote goes into, that it won't happen. And I'm saying this piece of it because I heard it from kids today, because they sat down and said, well, what about the elderly? Like, they're going to be the people who mess this up, and they're stuck in these places. Could we, with a pop-up concert, also do this thing? But that would be like a government teacher could sit down and say, how do I reach into a retirement home in order, like, how do the kids solve that? So the kids are raising these questions, like they hear things and they're raising questions, or we have things that we know are issues that we say, and they'll come up with the answers. Like the how, actually the kids will come up with the answers.
Yeah. Now I want to go back to what you said before about how sometimes they're going to fail, right? Because I think that's so critical, and I want you to tie that, because you do it well in the chapter. I want you to tie that design thinking and learning from failure to how we build a stronger democracy, right? And how that fits in with the role of education in making sure that our kids are democratic citizens that are able to make good decisions.
Did you just hear that question? That is like a PhD.
I'm just throwing it out there because you wrote about it.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just give you my bias. I'm not sure right now how we do that. So where I'm sitting right now, I don't know. I think that these are really these are really big and important times, and I don't know. I think that we need to start by doing small things, and I think it's really important for our kids to learn how to do small things so that they can do big things. So so what I would say is exactly what I would go back to my Ruth Bader Ginsburg thing. I sat down and said to kids, let's talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They told me everything except for the fact that she was best friends with Anthony Scalia. I sat down and talked about Scalia, and then I said, okay, I'm asking you to go and have those conversations with somebody who you know disagrees with you. And I want you to figure out how you're going to end up riding an elephant with them. How are you going to end up being their partner at a Halloween party? And I think that that's what we all have to do in general. Beyond that, then we're talking about systems, right? And really what I'm sitting down and saying to my kids is design systems. Think about systems. Think about when you look out there, where are there places where we aren't reaching? Because really where I started was that their experience in my classroom was a failed system. The standard model for teaching European aristocratic music was a failed system. That was really where we are. It was a really big judgment on their part that they didn't realize. And when they were allowed to say that, they felt great. They were like, they felt great. I felt horrible, but they felt great.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the same thing, right? So right now, we're sitting down and we're saying we're in a system. Where is the system? Where is the system failing, and how do we move that forward? And I don't have the answers to that, but I will tell you, and this is my PTAC plug, like this is the only answer that I've been able to come up with, is to sit down and say we must train teachers how to be at the table, to have those difficult conversations. We must pressure people about nuance. We must sit down and say, if you are in a state like Pennsylvania, that the needs of Philadelphia are not the same needs as Scranton, are not the same needs as Carlisle, are not the same needs as Wallenpaupack or Honesdale or smaller towns. It's different depending upon demographic and experience and what and all sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
Diversity, socioeconomic, cultural relevance. There's a whole host of experiences that are different. And if we don't have the conversations about what those needs are in each of them, then we're going to continue pitting things against each other. So I grew up in Indiana and did not have a great education growing up. And I had some great teachers, but I didn't have a very consistent education. And Indiana is politically very different than I am. And there were a lot of things, but what I will tell you that I learned in that school was that I learned that I needed to pay attention to other people's experiences, because what I was experiencing as a college prof's daughter was very different than very dear friends of mine who were farmers. And what my hometown has gone through in the past 40 years is something that we don't really talk about very much in this country. We don't really talk about having left rural America out there. In the same way that we're just now really talking about what the experiences are in the inner city. We don't talk about things that are uncomfortable. We talk about things that are comfortable. And if we can take that and have kids learn how to have those conversations, it's a process. How do you have the conversations? How do you go forward? How do you get back up and try again? If they can do that, then we can as adults do that. And if we can as adults do that, then we can do something here. But if we can't, we're done.
Well, that's a phenomenal answer to a very difficult question that I gave you. And I just want to say you gave a great plug to 2 chapters in the book that talk exactly about that rural opportunity gap. One by Lindsay Jensen and one by Andy Hargraves, who both address that issue. Because I think you're right. I think, you know, in America, there are these, I mean, there's lots of different experiences, but there are 2 between rural and urban areas. There are 2 completely different lived experiences that are shaping the way that people see their world and what they view America as. And unless we can get them to converse with each other and talk and understand one another, have empathy for one another, we're never going to be able to come together as a country and have something that's cohesive in our democracy.
Well, and I think the thing is they're both hurting.
Yeah.
Like, I think we have to acknowledge that there has been enormous hurt in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And healing has to happen, but healing is only going to happen if, for those of us who are in the privileged position of being in the middle, if we start to have those conversations. And if the kids that we teach are able to understand that even if they aren't having those conversations, that they can understand that they are allowed to converse enough to understand. Right now, they're terrified to even step into it.
Yeah.
And they need to.
Well, we are out of time, but this has been awesome. It's been fun to talk to you about something totally different that we don't normally talk about. So this was great. But thanks so much for taking some time today. This was Mairi Cooper, not only a Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year and president of the Pennsylvania Teachers Advisory Committee, but also a chapter author in the upcoming book, Flip the System US, How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy. Thanks, Mairi.
Thank you.